There is an area in Russia called Siberia, which you're all familiar with. A land that's vast, extremely cold, has a lot of forests, and of course, a lot of brutal acts took place in this area. Whenever someone hears the word Siberia, you automatically think of gulag and extreme temperatures. You have to know that the concentration camps in the Soviet Union that were mainly in Siberia wasn't a Soviet invention. These existed during the Russian Empire when the Tsars used to run it. And if you've seen our video about Leon Trotsky, you'll note that he and his family spent some time in there during the Russian Empire. But the name gulag was given to these concentration camps during Stalin's era. And the reason for that is during Stalin's reign, these concentration camps were filled to the brim. These prisons had a few hundred people in the Russian Empire era. But when you get to Stalin's era, each concentration camps had at least 2,000 to 10,000 prisoners. It's one of the most brutal experiences a prisoner can have, because as soon as the light comes up and they open their eyes, they have to work until the day ends. But that doesn't mean when the sun goes down the day ends. It actually lasts much longer than that. So many problems like the weather, the amount of food, the disease, and all this made it extremely hard to survive this experience. Usually the people that went to these gulags were people that said something against the Soviet regime. But that was just the beginning, because later on, most of the people that made the Soviet Union concentration camps or the gulags were normal people that got extremely unlucky. Because it has been said, a lot of people were not even guilty of doing anything wrong, but they were sent to these gulags for years on end. So you could say life for people was extremely hard, since you were terrified to say anything wrong about the government or its leaders. Because maybe your family member would snitch on you and send you to a concentration camp. If you've seen how Stalin grew the Soviet economy, you mainly have to think about the slave labor that was happening in these concentration camps. With the help of these slaves, Stalin made the Soviet economy go from very in advance to somewhat comparable to the Europeans. And this was huge, especially since World War II was coming up. Any type of hard labor that was done in the Soviet Union, especially during Stalin's reign, it was done in these concentration camps, and they didn't have to pay anything for it. They were literally slaves. One of the saddest things about these gulags is that there were a lot of children that were inside these concentration camps. And the reason there were so many kids is because after the October Revolution, it's not like Russia was all dilly-dally and everything was perfect. There was literally a civil war going on where it lasted many years and more than 8 million people died. And these 8 million people had a lot of kids, and these kids had no parents anymore. And whenever the Soviet guards would find children in the streets, they would just send them to these gulags so they can work there. When World War II begins and the Germans tried to invade Russia, some of Stalin's advisors say we should bring some of those young concentration camp workers to use as soldiers. But Stalin heavily refused because he said, we don't have a lack of soldiers. And if they come here, the Soviet economy will collapse, because the economy of this country was extremely dependent on the slave labor. In the war, the generals and the higher-ups would tell the soldiers, if you're scared or if you run away from the battle, you will end up in concentration camps. And this heavily worked because it made the young soldiers of the Red Army to fight even harder. And truly, they would rather die in the war than have to suffer for many years in these camps. But let's somewhat go inside these gulags and see what's going on. The guards that were chosen for these gulags were heavily loyal to the Soviet regime, and they were somewhat psychopaths. So anyone that did something wrong, they would pretty much kill them with ease and feel nothing. And of course, they would treat the prisoners like crap as well. The place these people would sleep in these gulags were wooden sheds that had no insulation, and there was no bed. It was just wooden desks everywhere, and you had to sleep together with your bunkmates. And you only get a blanket in this extreme temperature as well. So these prisoners were kind of forced to sleep together to help each other warm up. When the sunlight came up, you're supposed to wear your clothes to start working. And the clothes are extremely ridiculous because it was a thin pants, a thin shirt, a very low quality jacket, and you get a hat. And if you're lucky, you might get one of these Russian hats we all know and love. Even though most of these prisoners were normal people that didn't do anything wrong, but that doesn't mean there were actual hard criminals in these gulags, because there were. And pretty much they were the ones in control because they would bully everybody, especially for food. So a normal person couldn't even relax in a place like this because they were surrounded by insane guards and psychopath prisoners. Don't even get us started on the food, because it was the lowest quality of foods that would keep a person going. And of course, the gulag prisoners that were actually criminals would probably steal it from the normal person. So that normal person was mostly starving during this time. In most of these gulags, the people weren't afraid of the guards mostly. They were afraid of the actual criminals, because they were the ones running the show inside it. It's similar to the US prisoners, where nobody's afraid of the guards, but they're afraid of the actual criminals. 15% of the prisoners in these concentration camps were women. But it's not like these women did anything wrong. Most of them were there because either their husband, brother, or father was sent there, and they were forced to go as well. But thankfully, the women and the men weren't mixed inside the prison. But all the guards were male, so of course, a lot of raping and sexual harassment took place in the female section, and they did get pregnant. But once they had the child, the state would take away the child so the mother could never see it. So what did the people actually do for labor? It was mainly mines, like a coal mine, or an aluminum mine, or an iron mine. And some places that had these gulags next to a forest, they would cut down trees, cut the wood and send it to different places. And all this is extremely hard labor. It is pretty much insane to know, because these are all slaves and they're working for free. And experts believe during Stalin's reign, there were 18 million people in these concentration camps. Some may think that Stalin would only enslave people that were not Russian, but that's not true, because most of the people in these concentration camps were Russian, because that was the main population of the country too. A lot of these prisoners would die before they got released, die of starvation, diseases, or hypothermia. They didn't have proper clothing, and if the cold air got into their system for too long, there was a high chance they would die of the cold. And don't even think about the nurse or a doctor, because there are none, and they are not trying to help you whatsoever. So in a way, these slaves worked until they died. Do you see this small canal? It's called the Volga-Don Canal, and you have to know that it's handmade. And it wasn't made by employees. It was made by slaves from these gulags. It was literally dug up with hands, and it's 101 kilometers long. In only 3 years, with the help of 200,000 slaves, this canal was dug with hand. And every time you see this beautiful canal, which exists to this day and it's extremely important, just know that 12,000 people died making it, and their grave is at the bottom of this canal. But the question is, could anyone actually escape the gulag? Yes, of course you could try, but most of the time you couldn't, because the guards had free will to shoot anyone that tries to escape. But a few lucky ones actually successfully escaped these gulags. There are stories of people escaping to China, some even escaped to India, and some escaped to Finland. This is one of the most famous escapees from the gulag, Vladimir Chernavin. He successfully escaped a gulag that was in Western Russia and successfully went to Finland. And this is insane considering how hard it is to escape the gulag and actually go through an entire country and be safe. But the best part is that his wife and daughter were waiting for him in Finland. And when they got together, they flew to England and lived there for the rest of their life. On Soviet paper, these gulags were a normal prison that had some jobs to do. But in reality, it was the exact opposite. It was truly a nightmare slave labor camp. But this only lasted until Stalin. When Stalin died in 1953 and Nikita Khrushchev took over, one of the first things he said, this is not how you treat your people. And Stalin's way of treating these people were extremely brutal. So after he took office, most of these prisoners were released other than the actual criminals. After these men and women were released from these gulags, they kind of made a deal with them to never talk about what you've seen, because you might just go back. And the only stories that we have today are the people that actually escaped the Soviet Union after escaping these gulags.